Well, everyone, the Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus was one of those phones that came out many years ago, and Samsung has since actually taken this Plus lineup and has actually made a pretty solid phone from it. The S22 Plus should have already came out by the time I'm making this video, and I'm going to tell you the S21 Plus was a solid phone, the S20 Plus was very beautiful as well, even the S10 Plus is still one of my favorite looking phones that I've ever owned, and for the S8 Plus, this was actually the originator in a way. We had like the S6 Edge Plus, I think, and some other Plus devices here and there, but this was the first one where it was like actually the S lineup and just like the bigger model of it. Now this one came out the same time as the Galaxy S8, and as I mentioned about the Samsung Galaxy S8, the S8 Plus is still a very good looking phone, but it still just has a massive issue with it, which is the software. It just doesn't make any sense to buy this phone anymore. If you currently are still using this phone, I would love to hear your experience in the comment section below, but I wouldn't recommend buying it anymore just because it is fairly outdated. Now, Samsung did something really crazy recently. They actually increased the longevity of their Samsung phones yet again, it looks like. So it looks like we're going to be getting 4 full OS years of updates. Unfortunately, that's not the case for the S8 Plus. It did stop a couple of years ago, but it still turns on, it still runs the software and everything, which we'll get into in a second. Now, if you want to buy some phones I would recommend, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there, help support the channel at the same time. The front of the Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus has that 6.2-inch Super AMOLED display, and it's a 1440p panel, and this was the first time, if you guys remember, that Samsung actually removed the home button for their Galaxy S lineup, and this was a really good choice. I mean, since then, we've gotten, less bezel around it overall, but to even look at this phone, it just doesn't look that outdated. It had a curved panel on it, it was a massive display, and funny enough, this panel is actually higher resolution than the Galaxy S21, and I think the S22, by the time that comes out and with the way the specs are leaked and everything, it looks like that panel is still 1080p. Although this one isn't as good as the newer ones because it doesn't have 120Hz or anything, it's still pretty crazy to me that a panel like this, that came out back in 2017, still holds up this well almost 5 years later. Now, we did have a USB Type-C port on the bottom, which was really cool, with Samsung DeX, which is awesome. It had a headphone jack as well, which is really cool, and on the back it had a glass back, which was awesome, but it also had that fingerprint sensor, which was in a very weird spot. It was right up there next to the camera, and that was a very awkward spot. They did bring it down with the S9, and then they brought it into the display on the S10, but that was a really weird choice with Samsung, and I'm not too sure why they did that. Now, overall, we still had wireless charging and everything like that on this phone, and it was still a really good feeling and looking device. Even now, I've compared it to the S21 Plus not too long ago, and it's very crazy to me how good of a job Samsung did with this type of device. Unfortunately, they didn't keep the software that, long on it, which was very weird, but it is what it is. There's not much we can do about it. So, in terms of the build quality on the outside, that pretty much covers it up there. Now, in terms of the camera setup, this device does have a single 12 megapixel camera on the back. It's a wide angle lens, but we also had an 8 megapixel wide angle lens on the front with a 2 megapixel iris scanner. And as I mentioned back then when I got this phone and when I talk about it now, it's very impressive how great of a job this camera still does with the sensor that it had. So it was able to do 4K videos on the back, 1440p videos on the front, which does seem kind of outdated now, but back in 2017 basically all devices had that capability, so it's not like this phone had something worse than what was there in the competition. Most phones at that point can only shoot at these resolutions too. And funny enough, and I mention this story all the time, there were a lot of videos that I've watched recently of people at concerts and stuff, and there was one in particular, and the camera quality was actually really good, and the person commented saying, hey, what phone took this photo and video or whatever, and the person mentioned that it was the Galaxy S8 Plus, which was so crazy to me. Now, obviously this was I think last year, but this wasn't the year this phone came out. This was 2 years ago or something, which was pretty insane, and by that point the S8 Plus was already an old phone. So I will tell you, although the Galaxy S8 Plus camera today doesn't hold up really that well against the competition, it's still very impressive to me how good of a job Samsung did with this camera. Now, the biggest problems is it only has one lens. There's no multiple sensors on the back. There's also no 4K at 60 on any resolution on the front or the back. We also don't have 8K, which is kind of something that comes in basically all Samsung Galaxy S series devices now, so keep that in mind too. But I will still tell you the camera on this thing is still pretty decent, and I don't think it's a bad idea for this camera, but again, with the no extra sensors, with no high resolutions or anything. It just doesn't compare to the newer phones that well. But back in the day, it was pretty much one of the best cameras of that year. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now in terms of the software and longevity, I mean, this one is probably the worst area of this phone. This thing stopped at One UI 1, which was Android 9. And I mean, we're on Android 12. We're going to be getting Android 13 probably in the next couple of months, at least in the beta. So again, it doesn't really make too much sense to go and buy this phone. And in fact, this is probably the one area of this phone that I would highly recommend not buying this phone in. The fact that it's already outdated at this level just makes you it's such an unsecure phone in so many different ways, so it makes absolutely no sense to buy a phone like this. I know the build quality and everything could be deceiving, and although some of us like me may have hyped it up earlier, it makes absolutely no sense to buy it anymore. So that is the main thing to keep in mind, and that's just kind of the unfortunate, reasoning behind it. So keep that in mind, but in terms of that covers it up there. Now, in terms of the actual performance of this phone, it had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 835 chipset inside of it with 4GB of RAM on the base model, and it did go up to 6GB of RAM. Now, if you actually end up getting the higher end model, it's actually very interesting because that phone does have the same amount of RAM as something like the S21 FE, which is pretty insane. But the bottom one only has 2GB of RAM, so definitely keep that in mind. Now, what I will tell you about the performance of this phone is that I still think it's pretty decent. It's definitely not going to wow anybody. This phone has a very, outdated UI. I think One UI has gotten some improvements, and I always forget about that because I'm always comparing the latest, I'm always comparing the latest version to the next one. But I do think, Samsung has made a lot of improvements to One UI, and with this original one, it's definitely not at its best potential, I don't think. If this thing had One UI 4, that's completely different. But the fact that this thing is already outdated, is not getting any more software updates, full OS updates, it may be getting security updates here and there, but it's pretty much outdated when it comes down to that. And the performance is actually not bad. I have to be honest. It's not the worst performing phone I've ever had, but it definitely could have been better. And I think that's the best way to put it. I think compared to phones nowadays, it just doesn't hold up that well. It's very slow. There's not that much RAM inside of it. And the UI is just very clunky for the software that it is. So that's pretty much the best way to put it. I don't want to hate on this phone too much. I really like this phone, but that's basically how I'd sum up the performance. And the battery life, actually the 3500 mAh battery inside of it, it really wasn't a crazy big size battery at that time when it first came out, but I guess it got a little bit better throughout time. But I guess when it ended off, maybe it really wasn't at its best peak either. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So in terms of battery, that covers it up there. And to be honest, like I mentioned already, I would not recommend buying the Samsung Galaxy S8 Plus anymore. It makes absolutely no sense to me at all. I think you're much better off buying something like a Galaxy S10 or like a Galaxy S20. Those devices are just so much better in so many different ways. They're obviously more expensive and everything, but with that, more expensiveness, you're getting a much better phone, better build quality. Arguably, you're getting more software updates, and you're getting a more powerful phone. The main, problem with the S8 Plus to me was actually not the power. It wasn't really with the cameras. It was just with the software. It's just outdated. You're not getting any features, and there's going to be a time very soon where app developers are probably not going to be supporting Android 9. And whenever that happens, you're probably going to be the first one to experience it, and you don't want to be in that position. So that's the best way I can put it. I think the S8 Plus meant a lot, especially the Galaxy S8, but it just doesn't really hold up that well in 2022. So in terms of that covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.